continuing now in the same era, and within chapter 8, we're going to see now how social problems begin to take what the author calls central stage, as the government and society begin to identify and then grasp the enormity of the problems like poverty, for example. And we'll see how that begins to shape, different opinion and the strategies to deal with this. But we'll also then, in light of this, discuss how the role of science and social science played in illuminating basically how widespread the poverty problem had become. Even other than that, social, just dreadful conditions, as it was called, that most Britons lived in. That's the main crux of this topic, of this chapter, I mean. It's interesting, I think, how the author started off with the image and the story of the Titanic. It's really, really kind of a genius, starting the chapter off with that, where this iconic example of industry and power and wealth, represented in the Titanic, the ship itself. In the early 1900s, there was nothing like it built before. And it was so, the pride and the expectations that went along with it, that it was basically indestructible. So it's really sad and a paradox that in its very first journey across the ocean, it hits an iceberg, something that shouldn't have been a problem if it did, but it was a big problem. And we see, 1,500 people or so die from this tragic accident. But it also then, the author is paralleling it to, what other vulnerability does Great Britain have going into the 1900s? You could see the arrogance, I should say, kind of associated with the Titanic, because they seem that it's so indestructible that probably those on watch in the fog crossing the Atlantic maybe had a little bit of narcissism, or a little bit of arrogance, to the point that maybe they weren't watching like they could have or should have. Maybe there wasn't a need to, if it's that indestructible. But in the same way, if Great Britain had raised to such a prominence, even a zenith like we had talked about, maybe it could be kind of blinded, by that, and blinded to its even vulnerabilities. And we even talked briefly about how the zenith didn't really last that long. So again, the Titanic is an imagery of the best of the best, the wealthiest, the strongest, the most powerful, but being taken out actually pretty quickly in some ways. So it's kind of neat how the author used that to symbolize this backdrop as we discuss Great Britain and the things that are going on in it. Moving into the social problem as the chapter's title, we see this thing called the social question, or the advent of what we'd even consider today as the modern social sciences. Things that we use today were developed or started, in this era, as sciences began to help measure, quantify, what was going on in different realms of society. And it's a really important advent. The book even talked about how 90% of the wealth, Great Britain's wealth, was owned by 10% of the population. That disparity is amazing. And it also then points to the fact that most Britons were living in dreadful social conditions. There may have been some positives as the wealth trickled down a bit, and created employment and some income wages for some, but largely the situation for most Britons was not very good. It's kind of neat too that it's in this chapter we see William Booth come on the scene, the one who's associated, of course, with the Salvation Army. A little neat voice that was going on through him at that time to society. England was that, again, it should be the church's job to take care of the poor, church's job to help guide people morally and to help them kind of rise out of their current situation. So it's kind of neat the backdrop, everything else we're talking about. We see individuals like William Booth stepping forward, and even his charge for the church, and that should speak to us today. We even see today more and more where the governments or other things are wanting to raise the village, so to speak, kind of concepts that children are supposed to be raised by a village. You're talking about the state's involvement in all aspects of our lives, so to speak, compared to it being individuals or parents and the church's role to do these things, let alone take care of social problems like poverty. We also see here this discussion of the racial difference. Again, we mentioned that in context of how colonial subjects were treated in comparison to British subjects of the homeland when it came to suppressive behaviors, suppressive actions by the state. But here we're talking about racial differences too when it comes to how they would have approached social reform or how they wouldn't approach social reform. A case in point to that would be, again, how you view or classify others. We see the advent of Darwinism, Charles Darwin and his propounding of natural order, natural selection, things like this. And as quickly as that spread and was adopted in the British culture and other parts of the world too, including the United States, it became okay with accepting the plight of other people, or the success of others, as if you have this living organism mentality of a survival of the fittest, that the strong will rise up and the weak will eventually die off and be replaced and so forth. That's going to affect your mindset. That's going to affect how you approach social reform, because it's going to affect if you believe people can be reformed, actually, if you think about it. And then you add the concept of eugenics, which is amazing in a bad way. You've got this new ideology that if you can take in consideration the size, the shape of a human skull, as well as a person's height, and just by those alone, you can speak to their intelligence, or you speak to their potential for being moral or not. It's quite amazing. It's almost like so simplified sounding here today that it's a little bit comical to me when I think about it. But yet this was very serious to them. They were very convinced of things like this, that you can take measurements of somebody or make assumptions at a distance by someone from different cultures because of their color, height, shape and size of the skull, and you can just basically label them how you wanted with these assumptions, as well as then many times consider them inhuman or subhuman. And we see that these sciences now are bringing reason and rationalization behind prejudices that had already existed. Now we've got science proving that was all correct after all in many realms, and that's going to have a huge impact on social change. And as a matter of fact, in where social change and even social reform, as we discussed in the past, where there could be an idea of raising somebody up and even exporting that concept in what we talked about in other parts of the world, where through guidance and instruction, a person can change and rise up or rise out of their circumstances. Well, that's going to be questioned now, or definitely not as universally believed, because if you now have come to the conclusion that some people are just immutable, some people, no matter what you do, how much training you do, how much help you give them, they cannot change. And if you believe that somebody cannot change, it's going to definitely affect how you try to aid them. You're not going to be trying to aid them to improve themselves. You're more going to try to now do social reform to contain them or to cause them to not negatively affect your society. It's a huge, profound difference in thought, and it's important to what was going on during this time. The government then would have been charged with trying to secure its racial health especially if you see others as backwards and imperfectible, then you're going to then see your job as a government to kind of secure a racial health. And you're going to permeate those concepts through teaching in the society and even women at home trying to raise, British pure little children and so forth. It's going to permeate your culture and then how you're going to address others. We see with the mass population, like in London, Jewish, Irish, people from other colonies, etc. This big alien invasion that's happening in the homeland, especially in London. Some of the reactions to this were concerned about a degeneration of the British Empire. They're concerned about all the impurities that this represented. Some of the actions taken to protect British jobs, like the Aliens Act of 1905. It was enacted to protect jobs for Britons, basically, as opposed to those jobs going to some of these new immigrants from different nations and different people groups. A new liberalism then was beginning to take shape and being forced upon the society just because of all the influx and them trying to grasp all this, let alone these sciences that are justifying these racial differences. Moving into our responses to question 1 for chapter 8, it was talking about why did the Victorians rediscover poverty in the late 19th and early 20th century. The word rediscover, obviously in the question, points to the fact that poverty wasn't something new. It had been there before, but to a rediscovery really it talks about how how problematic and widespread poverty had become. And I would put forth my response to include that first, the British Empire, or the rediscovering of this during this Victorian era, could have had to do with empire motivations and the British government again wanting to make sure that as it was reaching new global heights in power and prestige, etc., that these big epidemic problems of poverty, for example, wouldn't cause a degeneration or a backward movement for the empire itself. Very motivated by trying to understand how to deal with social problems to basically contain it and to keep it from adversely affecting Great Britain's prowess and progress around the world. So again, the epidemic of the poverty would have been illuminated by this desire for the empire to kind of sustain its power, its prominence, etc., and then to perpetuate kind of this racial healthy British Empire going forward. Secondly, the Victorian Britain era is hallmarked by a fascination for sciences, both amateur level and professional level alike. Science and the different sciences, natural sciences, social sciences, etc., was a fascination for this culture. You add to that its interconnectedness around the world, and that Britain would have access to cultures and ideas and sciences and facts and coming from all over the place. And it was an appetite that continued to grow in the Victorian era. And then if you even had amateurs, let's say your regular Joe, also enjoying and diving into science and sciences, it just creates this whole cultural awareness that actually also illuminated the poverty the level of poverty, and began to try to explain why that happened. As I mentioned early on, that we see out of this time frame the birth of the modern social sciences, and that it began to challenge some of the liberal political economy's view, where poverty was an individual problem. as the science began to measure and investigate the situations and doing case studies, etc., we even began to see that science began to discover and that there's myriad factors involved in poverty, well beyond an individual's control, even beyond a country's control, especially with the interconnectedness of economies, around the world. We saw in the Great Depression, 1873, with money's being pulled out of the rail stocks in the United States and by Austria, etc., and then banks collapsing in Germany and so forth, had a huge impact on Great Britain. And we see this interconnectedness. Well, in the same way, then, how can we blame individuals, or at least always blame individuals, for being impoverished, especially if they were caught up in a bigger realm of what's really going on? So these sciences and social sciences begin to ask those questions and actually begin to lessen this liberal political perspective that it's the individual's fault. It's very, very key to answering, this question. I think then would have been fascination for sciences and explaining things and measuring things, as well as the British government's goals to maintain dominance around the world. In the second question then goes into the racial differences that were essential to the discussion of social reform. I already mentioned aspects to this, but when responding to this question, we can see that we would cite pertinent information related to natural selection, eugenics, concepts like that just spread like wildfire, and then would have affected or even helped reinforce racial differences if there already were some, which there were, maybe even cause new racial difference perspectives, with sciences like this. But I thought it's really unique, and I kind of mentioned it before too, but to again say it in context of this question, that if you have like somebody like Darwin, who's observing living organisms, and now correlate this survival, natural order, natural selection in living organisms, correlate that to society and civilization being an organism, a living organism, and that within this living organism, the strongest would rise to the top, the most brilliant would rise to the top, the best representative of the pureness of a race, etc., would rise to the top, and it further justify why those who did not were weak or just unable, and eventually even kind of discarded to the side in a real natural way, supposedly. This is a huge departure from biblical context, isn't it? It's a huge departure from God and imploring us to consider others greater than ourselves and to look out, for others beyond ourselves. A complete reversal of those kind of Christian heritage kind of concepts and so forth. I'm looking forward to seeing the answers that you guys put forth and responding to this and discovering other elements as well. But again, this is all central to this discussion of social reform. Again, it can affect if you're going to go from trying to raise people up in a guidance kind of format versus just trying to contain, a problem. It's a big difference on how you're going to approach social reform. Moving to question 3, I want to highlight several things here. I want to bring, let me just start with reading the question. How did attempts to improve the social condition of Britons lead to the development of new ideas about the responsibilities of the individual and those of the state, and that how they challenged the assumptions of the liberal political economy? Because poverty ran counter to the successes touted by the liberal political economy. And the liberal political economy, golly, it's hard to keep saying, also would not have really thought about, or definitely would not have taken responsibility for poverty, especially since they see that, or it was seen as an individual's problem. So liberal political economy, all they would have been doing is touting its prowess in developing markets and wealth, and not about social problems like poverty. But Social workers like Henry Mayhew, someone I definitely want you guys to remember, Henry Mayhew began to advocate that poverty reflected victimization more than it indicated moral failure. And even his way of doing social observation in science is key to note. It's participant observation, it became known as, where you're actually sending somebody in the field, either yourself, if you couldn't go in because the context didn't allow for that, you send a female in, so forth. But the point is, there's somebody in the middle of the situation, observing, asking questions, experiencing what was going on. So in real time, real intimate kind of data, and now you're working with, instead of just everything being from a 10-foot pole distance or more, this participant observation concept is really, really key. I really want you guys to make connection to that. And the gentleman, Henry Mayhew, that really was noted as one of the first one to really take observation to this participant level. He was able to study individual stories, and because of that, he was able to highlight them in articles and newspapers, and help create awareness and even some sympathy or maybe some empathy, for individual cases, especially related to women and children as victims of what society was doing to them or the economy was doing to them and so forth. So it's really important. And then because of this, it would incite more of a state's role to get involved, but maybe in a way of not just a pure just handout, but with an idea of still trying to raise somebody up or whatever, or at least to kind of partner with an individual by giving them assistance while that individual also took initiative to change their circumstance. So kind of a partnership kind of an approach. And so then again, instead of blaming the poor for their condition, the state began to take on more responsibility. Key to this then is, or specific examples of this would have been ideological changes represented by the People's Budget of 1909 and proponents of that like Lloyd George. This is really key because this is a departure from the liberal political economy. We talked about in the overview starting this chapter some of the changes that began to kind of be different than, or to be challenge a bit of the liberal political economy. Here's a perfect example of that. The People's Budget of 1909 and Lloyd George were beginning to fly in the face of some of the tenets of the liberal political economy, for example, cheaper government. Here, the People's Budget actually created taxes, specifically targeting the wealthy, both in income tax or capital gain tax on selling land. It even imposed a death tax to wealthy as well. And so we see taxation being reintroduced, making government not as cheap, so to speak, but also doing it so it supported welfare measures that we see come on during this era of discussion. We also see the taxation on tobacco and alcohol sales as another way to sponsor these welfare measures that created state projects, which created state jobs. It funded Social Security and pension plans and so forth. So the People's Budget, Lloyd George, making those connections is key, and how that is, if that one example alone shows a big difference then in kind of going against some of the liberal political economy that had gotten written to where they were, but wasn't really addressing some of the things that should, like poverty and some of the other social problems. Where now that those are being addressed, we're saying, hey, okay, well, maybe we can't just blame everything on the individual after all, and maybe the state should do a little bit more about it. Matter of fact, in this situation, coming up with some taxes, so forth, to be able to fund some things, to do things about elderly people retiring, some of the other things that were being dealt with, by these. So question 3 is intriguing, and I'm curious to see some of the things that you bring forth on this as well. Looking at my notes one last time, mentioning anything else I wanted to make sure that we brought forth. Also, it was important to mention eugenics, but then of course we see Charles Darwin being mentioned throughout this chapter, in Darwinism and this whole idea of natural order, natural selection, and so forth as well. It's amazing how all these ingredients are coming on the scene right during and after World War One, and all the things that were causing Britain to change internally and externally. Fascinating discussions. I'm looking forward to seeing you guys' submissions.